While the Christian world has contented itself with the domesticated and simplified version of evil, represented by the term Lucifer, a mistaken Latin translation that completely distorted the original meaning of the Hebrew expression morning star, Ethiopia has kept alive a much older and more disturbing tradition. In the time-yellowed parchments and on the vellum pages that exhale the perfume of sacred oils, a cosmology of evil is recorded that would make any Roman theologian reconsider their deepest convictions. This is not simply a matter of nomenclature or an academic dispute about translations. It is the difference between knowing the superficial shadow of a truth and confronting its naked, terrifying face. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition, preserved in the Ge'ez language and transmitted through priestly lineages dating back to the first centuries of Christianity, reveals a picture of the celestial adversary that transcends the limitations of Western dualistic thought. This is not the caricatured character with horns and pitchforks that populated the European medieval imagination, nor even the romanticized figure of the fallen angel that inspired poets and philosophers. What emerges from these ancient pages is something infinitely more complex and disturbing, an entity whose nature defies the simplistic categories of good and evil that Romanized Christianity imposed upon the world. You must understand that the Ethiopian Bible is not merely an alternative version of the Western scriptures. It is a vastly more comprehensive literary corpus containing between 81 and 88 books, depending on the ecclesiastical source consulted. It includes texts that the Roman canon deliberately excluded: the Book of Enoch, preserved in its entirety only in the Ethiopian version, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of the Covenant, and the mysterious Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth. It is precisely in these volumes that the true name of the great adversary emerges from the shadows, carrying with it implications that would have made the conciliar fathers of Nicaea and Constantinople tremble in their robes. The knowledge these texts contain is not the product of late theological speculation or casual religious syncretism. It represents the uninterrupted continuity of a tradition that plunges its roots into the deepest layers of ancient Semitic consciousness, preserving understandings that predate the Hellenization of Christianity and the subsequent Latinization of the faith. When Roman missionaries began to shape Christian doctrine according to the parameters of Greek philosophy and Latin jurisprudence, Ethiopia already possessed a mature and systematic understanding of the celestial hierarchies and the angelic natures that operated in both light and darkness. In the Book of Enoch, considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church and preserved only in its complete version by the scribes of that country, the being that the West reduced to the generic name Devil reveals himself as an entity of multiple facets and denominations. He appears as Satanel, Gadriel, Azazel, and Samyaza, each name corresponding to different aspects of his nature and the varied acts of rebellion he perpetrated against the divine order. This is not a matter of nominal confusion or contradictory traditions. It is the reflection of a cosmology that recognizes the inherent complexity of evil and refuses to reduce it to simplistic explanations. Satanel, whose name preserves the suffix El that identifies him as having once belonged to the Elohim, the divine beings, is not presented as the sole adversary of God, but as the leader of a rebellious hierarchy composed of multiple entities, each specializing in different forms of human corruption. Azazel is described as the one responsible for teaching men the art of war, metallurgy, and the forbidden knowledge that accelerated the moral degeneration of primitive humanity. Gadriel, in turn, is identified as the one who seduced Eve, sometimes being confused with Samyaza, the chief of the Watchers, the fallen angels who descended to earth to take the daughters of men as wives. This multiplicity of names does not represent contradiction or imprecision. It reflects a theological sophistication that Western Christianity lost in its pursuit of doctrinal systematization and simplification. The Ethiopian tradition preserved the understanding that evil is not a monolithic force, but a complex network of influences that operates through different channels and manifests itself in various forms of spiritual corruption. Each name carries with it not just an identity, but a specific function within the cosmic economy of rebellion against the divine. But there is one name that transcends all others in importance and power, a name that the Ethiopian texts preserved with almost reverential care, and that was rarely pronounced outside the most initiated monastic circles. This name, Sebel, emerges in the manuscripts as the original designation of the adversary, even prior to his first rebellion, prior to the moment when Satan took up arms against the Most High. Sebel, which can be translated as he who profanes the light, or he who contaminates purity, represents not just a name, but a revelation about the primordial nature of evil that completely escapes Roman theological categories. The discovery, or more precisely, the preservation of this name in the Ethiopian traditions, represents much more than an archaeological or philological find. It points to an understanding of evil that is simultaneously more intimate and more cosmic than anything Western Christianity has managed to conceive. Sebel is not presented as an external force opposing God from outside creation. He is described as a divine power that turned against itself, a light that chose to contaminate its own purity, an aspect of divinity itself that succumbed to the seduction of the ego and the individual will separate it from universal harmony. This revelation carries implications that would have shaken the foundations of medieval theology and that continue to challenge the basic premises of contemporary religious thought. If Sebel represents the original face of evil, prior to the fall, prior to the rebellion, prior even to creation as we know it, then evil is not an external aberration that invaded God's good creation. It is an inherent possibility within the very structure of divine reality, a shadow that inevitably accompanies any manifestation of light and consciousness. The manuscripts preserved in the monasteries of Lalibela and in the secret libraries of Axum contain more than simple names and angelic genealogies. They reveal an entire system of esoteric knowledge that uses divine numerical codes and sacred phonetics to encrypt the names of the dark powers. This is not primitive superstition or popular magic. It is a sophisticated spiritual science that recognizes the inherent power of names and the capacity of words, when pronounced with proper knowledge and intention, to invoke or banish forces that operate beyond the ordinary understanding of reality. The Ge'ez alphabet, with its characters that seem to dance on the parchment like symbols of a lost world, preserves not only the external form of these sacred names, but also the specific vibrations that each syllable must produce to access or neutralize the energies they represent. Over the centuries, Ethiopian scribes developed an elaborate system of correspondences between sounds, numbers, and spiritual forces that allowed initiates to navigate the dangerous waters of practical demonology safely without succumbing to the influences they sought to understand. When modern scholars try to approach these texts with the methods of Western philology, they often lose sight of the functional dimension of this knowledge. This is not simply about preserving historical information about ancient beliefs. These manuscripts contain practical instructions for dealing with realities that the contemporary secular mentality does not even recognize as existing. The name Sebel, for example, is not merely recorded as an etymological curiosity. It comes with specific warnings about the conditions under which it can be pronounced and the purification rituals that must precede and follow any invocation, even if made only for the purpose of study. The oral tradition that accompanies these written texts adds layers of meaning that completely escape external observers. Among the Beta Israel, the Ethiopian Jews who maintain traditions even older than those preserved by the Orthodox Christians, there are whispered liturgies that mention Sebel as the one who divided the heavens, the usurper of the divine throne, and the creator of the illusion of separation between God and his creation. These formulations reveal an understanding of evil that transcends simplistic morality and enters the territory of pure metaphysics. What makes these revelations even more disturbing is the fact that they did not remain confined to popular traditions or marginal esoteric circles. A 14th century manuscript preserved in the monastery of Debre Damo presents Sebel as the primordial name of the adversary, the one who existed before the fall, even before the decision to rebel against the divine order. According to this text, Sebel represents the principle of individuation taken to the extreme, the divine consciousness that closed in on itself and forgot its connection to the cosmic totality. This perspective offers an explanation for the origin of evil that is simultaneously deeper and more disturbing than anything Western theology has managed to produce. If Sebel is the name of the adversary in its primordial state, prior to corruption, then evil is not an alien force that invaded creation. It is a possibility inscribed in the very nature of divine consciousness. The capacity to separate, to individualize, to choose one's own will above universal harmony is not a flaw in the divine system. It is a necessary aspect of the freedom that allows consciousness to know itself through the experience of the other and the different. But why was this knowledge so carefully concealed? Why did the texts that preserve these understandings never find a place in the Western biblical canon? The answer lies in the revolutionary nature of these revelations and the threat they pose to any religious system based on external authority and control through fear. The systematic suppression of Ethiopian texts by the Roman ecclesiastical hierarchy was not an accident of history or the result of simple cultural ignorance. It was a deliberate policy intended to preserve a model of Christianity that depended on the extreme simplification of spiritual mysteries to keep the masses in a state of intellectual and emotional dependence. The Ethiopian manuscripts, with their complex and nuanced view of evil, represented a direct threat to this project of religious domestication, as they offered the faithful tools for a direct and personal understanding of the mysteries that the Roman Church insisted on mediating through its institutional authority. During the Italian invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, Mussolini's forces were not limited to military conquest. They executed a systematic campaign of cultural looting that specifically targeted the repositories of ancient knowledge. Italian soldiers, acting under orders that clearly emanated from circles that understood the real value of these manuscripts, looted monasteries in Aksum, Gondar, and other holy cities, removing texts whose content they likely could not even read, but whose power they intuited. Many of these manuscripts mysteriously disappeared into the private archives of the Vatican, where they remain inaccessible to independent scholars to this day. The Vatican's interest in the Ethiopian texts was not merely academic or collector-driven. Documents that have come to light in recent decades reveal that certain specific pages, those containing references to the original name of the adversary and the practices intended to neutralize his influence, were systematically removed or never included in the few editions that reached public knowledge. This selective censorship was not the product of religious prudence or pastoral concern. It was the result of a conscious policy of concealment that sought to preserve the Roman monopoly on the interpretation of Christian mysteries. Ethiopian theology, especially as developed by saints like Urid and preserved in the Zadokite priestly traditions, presents a view of evil that is incompatible with the simplistic dualism that became the hallmark of Western Christianity. In this tradition, evil is not an external force opposing God. It is a distortion of divine energy, an incorrect use of creative power that results in the fragmentation of the original unity. Sebel, in this context, is not a demon in the popular sense of the term. He is an aspect of divinity itself that chose the path of separation and self-glorification. This understanding of evil as corrupted divine energy, rather than an alien force, has profound implications for spiritual practice and the understanding of human nature. If the original adversary is a distorted manifestation of the divine light itself, then the battle between good and evil is not an external war fought on cosmic battlefields. It is an internal process of purification and alignment that each individual consciousness must face within itself. The enemy is not out there. He is the shadow that accompanies every movement towards the light, the temptation to use spiritual power for egoic ends instead of universal purposes. The Ge'ez language, as the oldest Semitic language in continuous use, preserves not only the words that designate these spiritual realities, but also the rhythms and vibrations that are necessary to access them safely. Ethiopian liturgical chants, with their hypnotic melodies and mantra-like repetitions, are not simply expressions of popular devotion. They are precise spiritual technologies designed to create specific states of consciousness that allow practitioners to navigate the subtle dimensions of reality without getting lost in the labyrinths of psychic illusion. The fact that these practices have survived intact through centuries of external pressure and forced syncretization attempts testifies not only to the tenacity of the Ethiopian people, but also to the real effectiveness of the methods they preserved. The successful resistance of the Ethiopian tradition to attempts at Romanization was not just cultural, it was deeply spiritual, based on the recognition that certain truths cannot be translated or transferred. They must be experienced directly through practices that have been refined over millennia of conscious experimentation. The Ethiopian dynasties, particularly the Zagwe and Solomonic lineages, did not simply consider themselves political rulers anointed by divine authority. They saw themselves as guardians of a spiritual heritage that transcended national borders and conventional religious identities. The Kebra Nagast, although known primarily for its account of the relationship between King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, contains passages that describe a false light-bearer who followed the Ark of the Covenant through the desert, pretending to protect it while secretly coveting its power. This description offers a unique perspective on the nature of the adversary that cannot be found in any other canonical text. The figure of Sebel, as preserved in the Ethiopian royal tradition, is not just an alternative name for the devil. It represents a completely different understanding of what constitutes spiritual opposition and how it operates in the world. Instead of the external opponent that characterizes Western demonology, Sebel is presented as the ultimate infiltrator, the one who disguises himself as a protector and spiritual guide while working to subvert the genuine connection between human consciousness and its divine source. This is not frontal opposition, it is subtle seduction, the corruption that comes disguised as enlightenment. The Ethiopian royal texts preserve traditions that describe Sebel as the divine spark turned inward, the deceiver of the stars, and the adversary not only of God, but of the inner light of humanity. These formulations reveal a psychological and spiritual sophistication that anticipates by centuries many of the insights that modern psychology considers recent discoveries. The recognition that the greatest spiritual danger comes not from obviously malevolent forces, but from impulses that present themselves as virtuous while serving egoic purposes, demonstrates a level of spiritual maturity rarely found even in the most advanced mystical texts. The preservation of this knowledge was not accidental. It was the result of a conscious policy by the Ethiopian spiritual elite, who understood that certain truths are too dangerous to be widely disseminated, but too valuable to be completely lost. The system of initiation that developed around these teachings ensured that only those who demonstrated the necessary maturity and stability had access to the deeper aspects of the tradition, while more external layers of teaching remained available to the general population. This gradual approach to spiritual knowledge contrasts drastically with the Western tendency to democratize information without considering the preparation or capacity of the recipients to deal with it constructively. The Ethiopian guardians of these mysteries understood that knowledge about the true nature of evil and the names of power associated with it is not academically neutral. It carries practical consequences that can be devastating for unprepared consciousnesses. The name Sebel, for example, is not merely an object of historical study. It is a vibrational key that can open doors in consciousness that may be best left closed until the individual develops the spiritual strength necessary to deal with what they will find on the other side. The oral tradition that accompanies these texts preserves specific techniques of protection and purification that must be employed whenever these names are invoked, even if only for study purposes. These are not primitive superstitions. They are practical acknowledgments that certain words and concepts possess power independent of our belief or disbelief in them. Language, especially when used with conscious intention and within appropriate ritual contexts, is not just a means of communication. It is a tool of transformation that can alter both the speaker and the environment in which the words are pronounced. The fact that these traditions have survived through millennia of historical change and external pressure suggests that they respond to deep and permanent human needs that transcend specific cultural contingencies. The search for understanding the nature of evil and the methods for dealing with it constructively is not a peculiarity of the primitive religious mentality. It is a universal concern that manifests in all eras and all cultures, albeit in culturally specific forms. The contemporary relevance of these Ethiopian revelations extends far beyond academic interest or historical curiosity. In an era when humanity faces forms of evil that are simultaneously subtler and more devastating than anything previous generations managed to imagine, the understanding preserved in the Ethiopian manuscripts offers perspectives that may be crucial for our collective spiritual survival. The recognition that genuine evil rarely presents itself with an uncovered face, but prefers to disguise itself as virtue and enlightenment, is a lesson our era desperately needs to learn. The figure of Sebel, as preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, offers a model for understanding contemporary forms of spiritual corruption that completely escape conventional moral categories. In a world where sophisticated psychological manipulation masquerades as therapy, where destructive ideologies present themselves as liberation movements, and where economic exploitation is clothed in the language of social responsibility, the ancient wisdom about the false light-bearer acquires an urgent and practical relevance. The methods of resistance preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, fasting, humility, sacred music, and above all the cultivation of spiritual balance, are not just ancient religious practices, they are time-tested technologies for maintaining perceptual clarity and emotional stability in the face of influences that seek to distort our understanding of reality. In an era of informational overload and constant media manipulation, these practices offer anchors of sanity that can be adapted to contemporary contexts without losing their essential effectiveness. The systematic suppression of these teachings by Western religious authorities was not just an act of cultural imperialism, it was a crime against humanity's spiritual heritage that continues to produce devastating consequences in our time. By reducing the understanding of evil to simplistic caricatures and depriving the faithful of the sophisticated tools for spiritual discernment that these traditions preserved, the dominant religious institutions left their congregations vulnerable precisely to the forms of corruption they claimed to combat. The real tragedy is not that this knowledge was lost, it was never completely lost, only concealed, but that it was deliberately kept out of the reach of those who needed it most. While the initiated elite preserved access to these traditions through secret channels and discreet societies, the masses were fed diluted and distorted versions that left them more susceptible to manipulation than if they had received no religious education at all. The name Sebel and the teachings associated with it do not represent mere historical curiosities or exotic theological speculations. They are keys to understanding forces that operate actively in our contemporary world and against which our conventional educational and religious systems have left us largely defenseless. The recovery and responsible adaptation of these teachings is not a matter of esoteric interest. It is a practical necessity for anyone seeking to navigate wisely the moral and spiritual complexities of our time. Until the global community has the courage to study these manuscripts on their own terms, free from the distortions imposed by Latin translation and Roman interpretive filters, the true name of the adversary will remain buried under centuries of institutionalized silence. But in the mountains of Ethiopia, where the wind still carries the echoes of ancient chants and where yellowed parchments preserve secrets that could transform our understanding of the nature of spiritual reality, this knowledge remains alive, awaiting the moment when humanity will be ready to receive it with the reverence and responsibility it deserves. The question that remains is not whether this knowledge will eventually be revealed. Historical forces are already moving in that direction, but whether we will be prepared to deal constructively with the implications of discovering that our most basic understandings of the nature of good and evil were fundamentally mistaken. The true face of the adversary, once revealed, will demand from us not only new intellectual understandings, but profound transformations in our way of living and relating to the subtler dimensions of reality. The name Sebel is just the beginning. What it reveals about the nature of consciousness, freedom, and spiritual responsibility may very well redefine the foundations upon which we build not only our religions, but our very understanding of what it means to be human in a universe where light and shadow eternally dance with each other in the infinite halls of cosmic consciousness.